Welcome to The Exchange. I'm Anthony Curry, filling in for Rob Cox. Today we have former FDIC Chair Sheila Bair with us to discuss her new tell-all book about the financial crisis called Bull by the Horns, and to give us her thoughts on what the future ought to hold for banks and their regulators. Well, Sheila, first of all, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
I know you do say in the book, and I think this has been echoed since by the likes of Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, saying that bank management should be properly chastised and basically exiled for making mistakes. When you look at the landscape now, especially, let's just stick with the big 5 or 6 banks, how would you characterize management there now?
Well, I think people can look at objective metrics of shareholder returns and profitability and stability of balance sheets that can inform that discussion. If you look at those metrics, I mean, it's really the mid-sized banks. It's the big regionals that are performing the best in Wells. Wells has been performing very well. Chase certainly is in much better shape based on those types of metrics than Citi or B of A. So it's really not my job to evaluate management or recommend management. It's the job of the board. But I think, based on objective qualifications, the board should make sure that they have people that are up to the task. And I think one of the issues with these very large, complex banks is they're extremely hard to manage from the top of the house. Some may wonder whether they can, even with very talented management, be managed from the top of the house. And that might be another reason why shareholders want to downsize them. It's a very small pool of people that can actually do it competently. Maybe your institution's just too big.
Yeah. Reading the book, I mean, what comes through there is what we'd already kind of gathered from the crisis, that there was a great deal of a race to the bottom by banks when looking at some of the regulators and which one they would choose, because they thought maybe the OTS, for example, now defunct, would be an easier regulator. But the way you describe it in passages in the books, it actually seems as if the regulators themselves were in a race to the bottom, bending over backwards to help the banks.
Well, yeah, I think everybody was doing what they thought was the right thing to do. But I do think there's a tendency of bank regulators in particular to identify their job with the profitability of the institutions that they regulate, and they're not the same thing. Regulators work for the government. They should serve the public interest. Banks are not an end in themselves. They're a means to an end to serve credit needs for the real economy. And so just because they're profitable doesn't mean that they're serving that function. And we had a lot of profitable banks pre-crisis, and they were doing a lot of stupid things and taking risks that blew up in their faces and our faces later on. So I do think that is probably an overarching theme of the book, and the philosophical disagreements I had with Tim was that I didn't identify the interests of the banks with the interests of the broader public, where I think the whole theory of the big bank bailouts was, well, if you get them profitable again, everybody else is going to benefit, and I just don't think that's really the way it worked out.
Basically, I look at the book and I see it as a big argument for consolidating all the regulators, having one regulator. Is that workable?
Well, I think you're really putting all your eggs in one basket. I recommend going down to 2. So if I would have the FDIC as the regulator for all the insured banks, because the FDIC has tremendous risk exposure by insuring those trillions of insured deposits. And I guess history has shown, this crisis has shown, they tend to be the most conservative when it comes to risk-taking. What is it appropriate to use insured deposits for? So I'd put them there. I'd have to have the Fed be the holding company supervisors, so to the extent there are going to be non-traditional activities in these larger holding company operations, I'd push those outside of the bank, have the Fed regulate them, and I'd give each of them backup authority over the other so they could each look over the shoulder of the other, and I think that would give us a more robust regulatory presence. I do, yeah.
What about internationally? After the crisis, there was this global desire to act in a coordinated effort to make sure that internationally banks were properly regulated. Now it seems as if a lot of the regulators are going back to their sort of nationalism. Do you see that just getting worse?
Well, look, we needed regulatory reforms, we needed better authorities, we needed stronger capital standards, but at the end of the day, none of that's going to matter unless the people who are in charge of these regulatory agencies are committed to serving the public interest, can exercise judgment independent of these large financial institutions. And, at the end of the day, long-term, well-regulated, well-supervised, well-managed, adequately well-capitalized banks are going to do a lot better to serve their economies and serve their shareholders over the long term than those that are taking risk for short-term trading profits. So I think that, it disappoints me that Europe is already undoing some of the Basel III Accords, diluting what counts as tangible common equity. Good for the UK for wanting to have higher capital levels than are required in the Basel III, and shame on the continent for suggesting that was giving them an unfair competitive advantage. And I agree with them that higher capital is a competitive strength, but that doesn't mean you should block it. That means that everybody should have higher capital standards.
Well, there was talk last year of people having SIFI envy.
Right.
So if you're a bank which had to have at least 9%, like a JP Morgan, those with only 7% would think we don't look as safe as those guys 9%. We should have it too.
I think to the extent high capital is viewed as a competitive strength, it is a competitive strength. And if I were a shareholder, if I were an investor, I'd be looking for banks with strong capital levels. Of course, one of the problems we still have in Europe is they don't have a leverage ratio, and those capital ratios they talk about are based on risk-weighted assets.
Right.
And there's a lot of ability using the rules they use in Europe to game the risk-weighted assets so that it looks like the assets are really safe. You don't have to hold much capital when on an absolute leverage basis they've got a lot of risk on their balance sheet. So that is something Basel III did not fix. That still needs to be fixed, but at least we have a leverage ratio now.
You're now working on the Systemic Risk Council, and that's an independent organisation lobbying, I suppose, for changes. As you look ahead at the next few months, you've got the election coming up. Are you worried in your role now that if Romney wins, there'll be a rollback of Dodd-Frank, or do you think they'll be less worried about repealing the whole thing?
Well, I don't know. I think the Romney campaign, they've said some things that are alarming. On the other hand, he has embraced things like stronger capital, ending too big to fail. I think he needs to be careful about how he wants to go about doing that. I think if you repeal Dodd-Frank, you're going to have too big to fail again. Dodd-Frank was all about ending too big to fail. A risk retention for securitization, those are all important reforms, which he seems to be embracing. But I think both candidates could do a lot better job speaking to this issue. Mr. Obama's been very supportive of Dodd-Frank, which I think is great. But if you look at how the implementation has gone with folks that he has appointed to these jobs, I think implementation could be more robust. I mean, the regulators at the end of the day are just too timid, and they need strong support from their president, and they need support from Congress. Instead of Congress too often tries to intimidate the regulators into backing down as opposed to supporting them for the tough decisions that they need to make.
What's ahead for you? You're a Republican, yet a lot of people in the Republican Party don't quite see you as one of their own, and the Democrats see you as a Republican. So. So well, you're kind of caught between two stools.
I am a Republican by party affiliation. I always have been. I ran for office as a Republican. I used to work for Bob Dole. So that is my party affiliation. But I am very much an independent thinker when it comes to financial policy issues. I don't think these issues are ideological. I don't think they're partisan. I think they're all about exercising independence, having good, basic, easy to understand, easy to enforce rules in place to make sure that risk-taking doesn't get out of hand the way it did prior to the crisis. And I think good conservatives, President Reagan had a great saying, which was, the role of government is not to protect us from ourselves, it's to protect us from each other. But we didn't protect the rest of the economy from the risk-taking going on in some of these boneheaded institutions. So I hope both parties, including the Republican Party, will strongly embrace that. Just because industry wants it or big banks want it doesn't mean it's pro-market. They might like their bailouts as much as anyone. So we need to have that independence of judgment.
Right. And if either President Obama or Governor Romney, if he became president, offered you a job, would you consider it?
Probably at this point, it'd have to be a pretty senior job to make sense for me to go back. And I have to be honest with you, I look at government these days and the low level of public confidence and the extreme difficulty of getting anything done. And I sometimes wonder whether I really would want to go back. I'm the kind of person, I like to do things. I like to take the bull by the horns, to use the title of the book. And I think it's just very frustrating for good people these days who want to accomplish things to go into government. And I would hope elected officials, as well as in the administration as well, think about that in terms of how regulators are treated, the kind of support and respect that they're given. If they want good quality people to take these jobs, they need to give them the support and the respect to be able to do their jobs.
Okay. Well, Sheila, thank you very much for coming by to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm Anthony Curry, and join us again soon for another episode of The Exchange.